Hey, history lover. You're listening to this podcast because you like great storytelling and learning from the past. Airwave History Plus is your ticket to the most popular history shows anywhere with ad-free listening, bonus content, early episodes, and more from 27 top podcasts, including History That Doesn't Suck, The Explorers Podcast, The History of World War II, Queen's Podcast, The Age of Napoleon, and many more. To get your free 7-day trial, go to the Apple page for this podcast and click subscribe. That's Airwave History Plus, the essential audio destination for history lovers. Available now on Apple Podcasts.
Welcome to True Spies, the podcast that takes you deep inside the greatest secret missions of all time.
Suddenly out of the darkness appeared Bin Laden.
You'll meet the people who live life undercover. What do they know? What are their skills? And what would you do in their position?
Vengeance felt good. Seeing these people pay for what they'd done felt righteous.
True Spies from Spyscape Studios, wherever you get your podcasts.
Hello, and thank you for listening to The History of World War II podcast, episode 487, interview with Dr. Shannon Monaghan about her book, A Quiet Company of Dangerous Men, the Forgotten British Special Operations Soldiers of World War II. Shannon Monaghan is a historian of modern war. She started her career interning in international arms transfers at the State Department. Since then, she has worked in strategy consulting and data analytics and taught writing at Harvard. Her latest book is A Quiet Company of Dangerous Men. At the height of the war, 4 SOE agents are dropped into Albania. From there, the war will turn to either Hitler or Stalin's advantage. Germany has 30 divisions in the region, and Berlin wanted to pull some of them out to help on the Eastern Front. These SOE agents are to organize, train, and lead resistance units, thus not allowing this much-needed infantry of Germany to fight the Russians. But even after the war, these men will go on to play an outsized but quiet part of world history, all the way to Soviet Russia's invasion of Afghanistan. Miss Monaghan, thank you very much for coming on the show today.
Thank you so much for having me.
So first of all, love the book. We're going to go into the details, but this is a subject that's not really covered a lot when it comes to World War II, so I certainly enjoyed that. But your book reminded me of how, I guess maybe the word desperate. Before the Americans come into the war fully after Pearl Harbor, the British are kind of on their own, and they have to gear up after Dunkirk. And so sometimes when you can't beat your opponent toe-to-toe, sometimes a bit of sleight of hand or other things, ungentlemanly warfare, if you will, is needed to continue to take the fight to the enemy. And I guess that's where the SOE comes in, to do what they can with what they have.
Exactly. And this is, to the British government, this really ironic moment that they have decided that they are going to actively encourage and create the things that the British Empire has been fighting against for so long, right? Guerrillas and saboteurs.
Exactly.
But this, to that point, I think as Americans, we have our own story with the war, and we often forget how long the British are in it before we are. Mm-hmm. So, this is the famous exchange, obviously, that Hitler gives to Churchill, Europe for the empire. You let me have Europe and I'll leave your empire alone. This is May of 1940, and Churchill also famously says no.
Right.
So the British are backs against the wall, and they are going to end up creating some of the most famous special operations units, including the Special Operations Executive, SOE.
Right. Famous, and yet, keep it down on the down low, because that's what Britons are known for. So
yes,
let's jump into this, and just to whet everybody's appetite. I mean, these guys are, you have to remember everything is relative to the time. These guys are going to have cool gadgets, not unlike James Bond. They're going to be operating in Eastern Europe as it begins to fall under Stalin's sway. And while these SOE agents are fighting the Germans, while they're fighting the Italians, they get betrayed I lost count of the number of times that they were portrayed, and yet they were still able to have an outsized influence in the region. Could you please introduce the four main characters to us? And this goes back to something I just said a second ago. After you introduce them, how did you get more information enough to write the book? Because we know the British love to keep everything, nice and quiet.
Yeah, so actually, I'll start there because it's a funny story as to how it began. I had never heard of this either. And I fell into this story because our wonderful algorithm overlords at Amazon recommended the memoir of Peter Kemp, in which he was fighting in the Spanish Civil War after I'd bought something else. And I was really surprised by this because Peter Kemp had actually fought with the nationalists in Spain. I want to make very clear, Peter Kemp was never a fascist. He was a romantic. He was a Democrat, but also pro-British monarchy.
Right.
And he was an anti-communist, a very fervent anti-communist. And I had never heard of anyone like that. And so I read this memoir and realized that he had fought in World War II as well. And so here's this man who fights throughout the Spanish Civil War on the side of the nationalists and then drops into occupied Europe to help communist resistance groups fight the Nazis.
Yeah.
Right. And so, willing to do whatever it takes for his country. Through Peter Kemp, actually, while he is in Spain, and I discovered these four men who they fight together throughout the war and they have these overlapping connections. So while he's there, actually, sheltering from shelling in a ditch, this young guy jumps in. And they start trying to talk, except the other guy doesn't speak any Spanish, and they start trying in French, and Peter's French isn't really that great, and the other one is fluent. It turns out this is Julian Amory, who at the time is an undergraduate at Oxford, neglecting his studies and acting as a journalist. And Julian Amory will become essentially their intelligence and political officer, serving throughout occupied Europe.
Right.
Julian Amory had gone to Eton with Billy Maclean, who had also gone to Sandhurst and was an officer in the Royal Scots Greys before the war began. This Lawrence of Arabia type people person, just a kind of a natural political operative and formerly trained officer.
Right.
And the fourth among them is David Smiley, who had also gone to Sandhurst. He was a member of another very storied cavalry unit, the Royal Horse Guards. And he and Billy Maclean had met on a troop ship in the Red Sea in 1941. Both of them had already been serving in the Middle East, and they were really trying to get into the war in North Africa at that point. They wanted to join the Somaliland Camel Corps. That didn't work out. They ended up in different units. Smiley actually in one of the commando units, in which Peter Kemp also served in a different commando unit.
Right.
But they just unfolded. They spent the entire war and actually most of the Cold War together, so they seemed rather irresistible to me.
Right. And you bring up a good point, because for Kemp, it goes back to the saying, the enemy of my enemy is my friend. Yes, he didn't like communism, but obviously Hitlerism has to be wiped out. It has to be stopped. And if you have to work with a communist, all well and good, because there's a greater need, I guess you could say.
Absolutely.
So
absolutely.
Before we go on, I want the listeners to know, and this is what I enjoyed from this book, and I think they'll get the same enjoyment that I did. This is almost like the story of World War II, but from the perspective of Albania and that region, Eastern Europe in general. You drill down into the characters, you drill down into the influence of religion, of course, the long history of hatred and distrust between these groups. And they live right next door to each other. So there's a lot of civil wars. There's a lot of fighting. There's a lot of blood revenge, whatever the proper term is. But I'm going to ask you to set the stage for us. It's 1943. We're talking about, for right now, Albania. There's nationalists. There's communists. They're all resisting the Axis powers. But not unlike China, when China turns come, it seems like they'd almost rather fight each other than the Germans and the Italians. And just to make it even harder for the SOE when they first come in, the Germans have just finished busting the Albanian resistance in 1943. So you talk about landing in there in 1943, desperate times, starting from scratch. These guys have really got their work cut out for them.
Yeah, they are landing in one of the more complicated places that also is a very small space with a lot of people competing in it. So Albania has been so first of all, it's a very mountainous area,
Right.
which makes it very difficult, for any centralized government to control. This is a question of geography, not the people, but the Romans struggled with Albania, which they called Illyria, right? Alexander the Great struggled with Albania. It was occupied by the Ottoman Empire for a very long time. It was then occupied by the Austro-Hungarian Empire. Within Albania, you have obviously the vestiges of these different invading forces over time. You have Roman Catholics in the north. You have Orthodox, Eastern Orthodox, and more in the central part of the country. There is also a large Muslim population. Within the Muslim population, there is also a particular mystic sect of Islam called the Bektashis. One of the warlords they will work with later in 1944 is a member of this particular sect. So there's a lot of complication on top of the fact that, as you just mentioned, there are communist resistance groups and nationalist resistance groups. The nationalists are complicated by the fact that there are Republican groups within that, and then there are royalist groups within that who back the former King Zog, who had been in control in Albania since the 1920s. After Albania got its independence from the Austro-Hungarian Empire at the end of World War I, it starts to develop its own new state apparatus. He makes himself president and then made himself king.
Oh, nice.
So there are a lot of different political affiliations and attempts at control. It's also layered on top of what is essentially a tribal society through which most things are organized. And the Italians have invaded on Good Friday, 1939. And as of 1943, so have the Germans. There is an awful lot going on here when you're about to drop in essentially blind.
Wow. Yeah, I'm just trying to picture, it's the equivalent of someone saying, build me a road on this pit of quicksand. I mean, it's just the ground keeps shifting politically. Everybody has their own agenda. And obviously there's a lot of personal vendettas against each other.
Yes.
At the end of the day, and you push this in your book, the British are like, oh my goodness, we just need you to fight against the Axis. You can do all this stuff later. But of course, the locals are saying, no, we're going to deal with this now. And so they're butting heads. But at the same time, the British are like, we'll give weapons to whoever, but you have to show us that you're fighting the Axis. And that's not always the case. So again, it's very difficult for these guys, especially like you said, they're coming into a region that's just a powder keg. So fortunately,
yes,
one of your main characters has a powerful connection. Sometimes it comes down to who you know, not what you know. And maybe if you could tell us about that a little bit. And then the part of the book that drove me absolutely crazy, where I was screaming at the pages, not you, screaming at the pages. Could you introduce us to the communist spy or the mole who actually ends up running the very office that these men report to? I mean, it just builds and builds and builds. And it drove me crazy for chapters.
It drove me crazy for years. So let me start with your kind of your invitation of how the intelligence apparatus works here. So I've mentioned Julian Amory, the journalist who jumps into the ditch. Right. Julian Amory was the younger son of a man named Leo Amory, who is a giant of conservative British politics and a close friend of Winston Churchill since they were at school together as children. And I want to make a clear point about Julian Amory. He absolutely had a powerful father, and he had no qualms about using that influence when he felt it was necessary. But Julian Amory was also absolutely worth it on his own. Right. Incredibly intelligent, very savvy, natural political operator, and absolutely willing to do what he needed to get things done. So actually, though he became a very famous conservative politician as well, actually, at the beginning of the war, Julian Amory, like the British policy in general you just described, was really suggesting that they need to back not just conservative groups, but also actually communist groups, because he realizes that they're the ones who are very clearly fighting hard here. Right. So he actually enlists his father's help to make sure that is able to happen initially. So he's working throughout the Balkans. He's essentially in an intelligence unit called Section D at the beginning of the war. But this becomes complicated by emerging British policy. So he does have these lines. They're essentially intelligence reporting units in Albania that get busted by the German invasion in 1943. So everything's kind of gone. So when actually it's David Smiley and Billy McLean who go in, to be clear, with a team of NCOs and some paramilitary experts, some other junior officers. It's not just the two of them.
Right.
In April of 1943, they have to drop into occupied Greece.
Wow.
Because there is no one on the ground in Albania. And the Greeks also have their own contestation between nationalist and communist units as well. So this is a very complicated situation. But Julian Amory eventually ends up in the staff office of SOE. There are multiple staff offices in SOE. Obviously, you've got the central, bigwigs in London, but then there are also more local offices. And for the Balkans at this point, the local office is in Cairo. It will eventually move to Bari in southern Italy once the Allied invasion of Italy takes place. But right now we're in Cairo. And there is a contestation that starts in the office that the men on the ground don't really realize of, should we be trying to do this thing you already described of, for heaven's sake, we will give weapons to anyone who will fight the Germans.
Right.
We don't care what your political background is. We don't care what else you've done.
Exactly.
We will give you the weapons. Or do you take a side? Right.
Ooh, right.
And do you try to put your finger on the scale here? And in the office, there are two people actually who would like to tip the scale. One of them is actually running the office, is a brigadier named Keeble, and he's had a bit of a career kerfluffle earlier, and he's trying to rehabilitate himself. Right. And he thinks he's found the perfect way to rehabilitate himself, which is to back actually Tito's communists in neighboring Yugoslavia, because he thinks no one else has figured this out yet, and he's going to ride to glory on Tito's coattails. Right. But within the office is a man named James Klugman, who is a bit older, very intelligent, speaks multiple languages, and is a Soviet mole.
Right.
He has been working to help them recruit all sorts of people over time, beginning with his days at university and whatnot. He has connections to some of the recruitment of the famous Cambridge Five, of which Kim Philby, for those of you who are Cold War aficionados, was part. And he is really, this is his job. He is trying to switch British support to the communists only.
Right. Yeah, but at the end of the day, I mean, we need numbers. I get what Amory's saying. We need the numbers because it seems almost an impossible task. At the beginning, why leave one hand behind your back? But again, the communists have their own agenda. They're very patient. They're very organized. They're very good. And Klugman is just, I guess, maybe the tip of the iceberg or a very good example of that.
Yes.
So they go in, but right away the regional tensions start to affect their mission, and it does seem, and you have to be honest with this, the communists do seem to be better organized. They work with the SOE agents until they don't. And then there's that tension there. And of course, the SOE agents are still trying to work on the Italians. Clearly, and again, it's not like they've got 50,000 troops. This is going to require guerrilla tactics. This is going to require stealth, but it's also going to require a little bit of luck. But they are going to the best of their ability, take the fight to the Italians.
Exactly. So what they're trying to do is, tie down divisions, make sure that you don't have extra troops if you're the Axis to use them elsewhere. Obviously, the war in Eastern Europe is heating up at this point. By the time we get to 43, Stalingrad has happened. Hitler really needs all these troops that he's got in the Balkans. He's got 30 divisions in the Balkans to use them somewhere else. Right. But if you can tie them down, you punch above your weight with a small number of people by creating paramilitary groups, which is what SOE is trying to do throughout the Balkans, then you can really help the war effort. So when Billy McLean and David Smiley drop in April of 1943, they are tasked with, you make an army out of anything you can find. Right. And what they find are a group of partisans. They're communist partisans. Their group is called the LNC, and they are led by a man named Enver Hoxha, who, spoiler alert, becomes the communist dictator of Albania until his death in 1985. Right. But here he is, Enver Hoxha. He's 30 years old. And they are starting to work with them. They're starting to train them. unfortunately, this is after they suspect David Smiley, who speaks not a word of Greek and is blonde, of being a Greek spy, and they imprison him for the better part of a week. But they eventually let him out. But he starts to realize already as they're moving him through the country that they very much don't want him to be recognized as a Brit. They're making him wear their own clothing and whatnot because they don't want him to meet the nationalist groups who are next door.
Wow.
They're called the Ballet Combattants. But they do. They develop an 800-man unit. It's called the 1st Partisan Brigade. And they're going to start, they train them in standard military tactics, and they're going to start ambushing. Mm-hmm. So this is Peter Kemp joins right before this happens. He drops in, but they set up their first major ambush. They're working with Enver Hoxha's essentially general. His name is Mehmet Shehu. He actually fought also in Spain on the other side. So Peter Kemp is told to keep quiet about this. But they go to set up their first ambush, and Mehmet Shehu and his men run into a German patrol on a hilltop. There are 20 men, 20 Germans, 800 communist partisans. And he comes back to Smiley and McLean and Kemp and says, well, there are Germans here. My first operation must be 100% successful. We must call it off.
What? That's crazy. Sorry.
And in his one, Billy McLean is very, very good at people and very patient. Mm-hmm. And everyone always described Billy McLean as languid and very sharp tack, though. And in one moment of losing his cool, Billy McLean looks at Mehmet Shehu and says, "Are you telling me that 800 partisans can't wipe out 20 Germans?"
Oh, my God. We're in trouble here.
It turns out to be 18 Germans, by the way,
right.
They counted.
Oh, my God. Yeah.
They don't, but this is not, I guess, to be fair, cowardice on the part of Shehu, who's a very brave man,
right.
Or his unit. What Shehu wants to do is conserve his ammunition.
Yes. They're already thinking about after the war or what after the Axis partners, the people are out, because, it's time to get the real war going, if you will.
Yes.
Oh, my goodness. Yeah. So they've spent all this time training these 800 men, equipping them, and suddenly not a lot. They're not getting a lot for their investment.
Not much to show for it. Now, they do eventually start to do some of their own operations, but it's also complicated by the fact that we mentioned the Civil War before. These groups are also trying to show that they're doing something, but they want to get multiple bangs for their buck. Mm-hmm. So the communists would have a habit of maybe doing a small ambush operation, but they'd make sure they would do it outside of a nationalist village. Because...
Oh, sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, no. As we all unfortunately know, what are the Germans famous for doing if something bad happens to one of their men near a village?
Reprisals.
Yeah. So the nationalists will complain, well, we would be trying to fight them harder, and they too are conserving their ammunition, let's be fair. But we keep getting attacked by the Germans because somebody else is setting up ambushes right outside of our town, and now we're getting whacked here.
That's clever.
So it's getting very, very complicated very, very quickly.
Yeah, you would think that war would simplify. We're the good guys, they're the bad guys, black and white, whatever. But no, and not only that, but it's getting more complicated as it appears that the Axis is going to lose. Them losing is still in the future, but it's probably going to happen. And so they're already thinking about their future, and they're ready to, like you said, they're storing up their ammunition. They're saving their men's lives because they're waiting for the real war. Now, because it is 1943, the good news is, before the year is out, Italy is officially out of the war. Yay. The bad news is the Civil War that we've been talking about seems to kick off in earnest, which further disrupts the SOE's mission. And the Germans are going to have to compensate for the Italians pulling out of the war. So as the Germans are coming, clearly someone has to slow down their advance to give the SOE and any remaining resistors time to prepare for their arrival.
Yes, and so this makes actually really everything more intense. So,
oh my goodness,
the Italians had been trouble, but not as much trouble as the Germans.
Right.
So everyone recognizes that now the power balance has changed. And the other thing that's worth raising, we all know this didn't happen, but in this moment, Churchill's talking about the soft underbelly of Europe, right? Which, as we all know, didn't turn out to be very soft, but regardless, there is this fear, thought, assumption, what have you, that there's going to be an Allied landing any moment. And now everyone needs to solidify their position. They need to give as good as they can. So everything has become complicated, and the Germans are a much more dangerous enemy. As Peter Kemp once said that the Italians are really gentlemen about it. If they were going to attack you, they'd shell you for a day first, and you'd know something was coming.
Thank you. Sorry.
Yes, thanks.
For the heads up. Yeah.
I think, as he put it, to paraphrase only slightly, the Germans were murderously businesslike about it, and they came for you with machine guns at dawn.
Yes.
So they're starting to. So first of all, SOE is starting to get attacked by German patrols who are now going to come down on them. David Smiley takes a surrender of one Italian unit, manages to have them have an artillery piece thrown in a lake so that neither actually the Germans nor the partisans, the communists, can have it.
Right.
There's fear that the Italians, who for very good reason are afraid of the communist partisans because they aren't observing the Geneva Conventions and at gunpoint feel that it might be smarter to hand over a few things. Some of the Italians do go over to the Germans. Most of them surrender. The Italians themselves are in a pretty bad spot. But David Smiley realizes, and obviously with everyone else, that they are going to need to protect themselves from the Germans, and they're going to have to get going. So he starts, with the orders of actually his superior, technically Billy McLean, blowing up bridges.
Right.
Mining roads, making sure that they are not going to be surprised by the murderously businesslike Germans. This really, really, really irritates Enver Hoxha because they wanted to use that bridge, the first bridge that David Smiley blew up, and why had he not received orders from the Stab, the communist partisans, what we would call general staff, I guess is what we would call it. Right. And David Smiley declares that he does not take orders from the partisans' general staff. And so there's a lot of tension. I mean, they are working together at this point. They are supplying Hoxha's men, but the tensions are really, really rising. So life is getting more complicated for everyone.
Right. But and like you were saying a minute ago, there are 30 divisions there. Hitler would love to pull out, however many of them, to, slow down or check the Russians who are coming ever westward. But now the Germans are actually moving in because the Italians are out. I mean, it's getting deadly. It's getting more complicated. And they're still trying to, somehow, it just seems to be falling apart because every time there's a mission, it seems like the SOE agents are coming a little bit closer to death when maybe they shouldn't, but clearly something's going on. Someone's talking to somebody, but we get to the meat of the Civil War, and the various sides, again, have their objectives. But what it really comes down to, and you beautifully unfold this in the book, what the communists want, what they need, is for the SOE agents to either get out or conveniently die, however they die, and the blame can be laid at the feet of the Germans because the Germans are now operating in the area. So if the communists can kill the SOE agents but blame it on the Germans, that's a win-win.
Yeah, so this actually happens a couple of times. Yes. So after about 6-7 months behind enemy lines, Billy McLean and David Smiley are actually pulled out of Albania. They're going to be sent to do a lot of debriefing and reporting. Right. And so this is fall of 1943. And in the meantime, SOE has realized, we need to put more people on the ground here. The operation needs to get a lot bigger. And they send in a brigadier.
Right.
To oversee the whole thing. And his name is Davies, Edmund Davies, but he went by, his nickname was Trotsky.
Right.
Not because, as Americans, we would assume this is a reference to Leon on Trotsky, but actually it's a reference to British slang from the time. There's another piece of slang called to be bolshy. Referencing the Bolsheviks, and that wasn't necessarily to be on the left. It was to be kind of combative towards authority.
Okay.
Right. And Trotsky, I think, kind of that nickname must have come from something around this. But remember, this is 1943. Stalin has just finished his purges, right? They're looking for all the Trotskyists in Spain during the Spanish Civil War. So to these partisans, this British brigadier who shows up being called Trotsky,
Ooh, not good.
It just feels sinister to them, right? So, and again, poor Brigadier Davies, who's dropped in, is briefed and is told, you're going to be giving arms to whoever's going to participate. And he said in his own memoirs, again, to paraphrase, when I was briefed in London and in Cairo, this sounded very simple. And then I got to Albania, I found that it was not.
Understatement.
Classic British understatement, right? So on their way out, David Smiley and Billy McLean end up being given a document by one of the non-communist resistors that they really feel proves it's an intercepted communist order that the communists are trying to reserve their arms and ammunition for the Civil War against the nationalists.
Right.
And obviously, the nationalists do realize that the Germans are eventually going to leave. The communists are going to stay. So again, everyone's tensions are going up. But after they leave, actually, Brigadier Davies' camp is overrun.
Yes.
And it's overrun after, he's been on the move. It's a large camp. They have a very large number of mules as pack animals. Just as a side there to keep in mind, almost all of this is being done on foot, or you're riding a mule, or you're using a mule to carry something. This is a very arduous endeavor. To be 6 to 7 months behind enemy lines in Albania is a very rough deal.
Right.
So if you think in terms of kind of modern deployments, this is extremely different. Multiply out those 6 or 7 months by quite a bit. But Davies is overrun after Enver Hoxha kind of multiple times assures him that he's safe, he's fine, and we will have plenty of advance warning.
Oh, yeah.
If anything happens, and then inevitably not. So eventually they're overrun, their men are killed, and Davies is rolled up and ends up spending, most of the rest of the war really in Colditz prison. Having managed to get himself and the officers with him out of a far worse concentration camp, essentially, by pointing out that this was not the done thing. This is against the rules of war.
Exactly.
So at this point, David Smiley and Billy McLean are going to be shipped back in. Everything has hit the fan at this point, and they are going to bring with them Julian Amory. Because they need at this point a very serious political operative who's going to be able to navigate between these very complicated tensions on the ground. And they're going to go back in essentially the spring of 1944. In the meantime, Peter Kemp is still there.
Wow.
And he's been sent up kind of north and northwest, and eventually he will end up being sent into Kosovo, which is a whole other story in and of itself. But during that time, he was told by the staff office through the radio, that he was dead.
Oh, that's right. Yeah, so don't even look for him. Don't even try.
Yes, and Peter Kemp signaled back, still alive, please refrain, wishful thinking.
I love the British. Oh, but I guess the communists were hoping, well, if we declare him dead, they'll quit looking for him, and maybe that will be our opportunity to make that a reality.
Exactly right. You can't. This is a really sick version of Double Jeopardy, right?
Exactly.
You can't kill a dead man twice. And they had a whole story that went with it. This communist partisan comes limping. Actually, this is before Davies has been rolled up. He comes limping into Davies' camp, telling this sob story of how Peter Kemp had been in this town and the Germans had invaded, and he and this German had, come face to face around a corner, and they'd both fired at the same time and fallen dead.
Right.
And Alan Hare, the officer who later told Peter Kemp the whole story, said, well, everyone was suitably sad. But
sorry.
I knew it couldn't have been true because, first of all, you never would have been quick enough to fire at the same time as a German. And second of all, your well gun would have jammed.
Yeah, but
This Peter did have he was carrying something called a well gun, which is an experimental British submachine gun, which was indeed infamous for jamming, and actually jammed on him quite badly in this wonderful moment in which he and Billy McLean ambushed by themselves and Peter's interpreter, a German staff car. But that was Alan Hare's method of telling Peter Kemp how the story had come down.
Well, it's all in how you deliver the stories, and the good news is obviously he's still alive. But is it somewhere around here? I don't want to mess up the timeline, but is it somewhere around here where people start, people on the SOE start going, we're getting some bad orders or orders that don't make sense to us, and we're here on the ground? I mean, are they starting to suspect that something smells funny, or am I reading too much into it?
I think there's a little bit of suspicion from the very beginning, but they don't quite understand it yet. There's always been something a little weird. So, we've mentioned, Hitler has 30 divisions in the Balkans. They're obviously, you couldn't fit them all into Albania, but there's sizable numbers here. There are also a lot in Yugoslavia, and Yugoslavia in this story really plays this overshadowing role because, first of all, it's larger. There are more people there, and also eventually because Tito, the leader of the ultimate leader of communist Yugoslavia, is actually the man behind the scenes, or his operation kind of overshadowing communist partisan warfare in Albania as well. And Enver Hoxha kind of owes a lot to Tito. And this mole in the staff office has long been making sure that only the right people, the right thinking kind of people, go into the Balkans, both specifically to Yugoslavia and to Albania as well. And Billy McLean and David Smiley had originally been slotted to go into Yugoslavia and kind of got boxed out. And it was actually a woman in the office. She was she was in the army, obviously, but she was working as part of the staff. She ultimately was able to convince Keeble to allow them to go into Albania. And there's a very sad part of that story that will come up soon. Right. Peter Kemp had been asked to sign a declaration that he'd been brainwashed in London, and that the communists were really the way to go. Right. I'm paraphrasing this, when he went in and declined to do this, and that's how he ended up in Albania. So there's clearly something weird going on. Yes. But they don't quite know yet. Obviously, this is very complicated on the ground, but they do find out soon, because after Peter Kemp's narrow brush with death, he is told. Well, let me back up. Peter Kemp is about to be sent to Kosovo, right? Which sadly remains in the news to this day. Obviously, and Kosovo is even more complicated because Kosovo is claimed by Serbia. And at this point, Yugoslavia, which is the official country, as part of their territory. And to the Serbs, it's very important because of a battle in 1389, which they lost to the Ottoman Empire. And this is this becomes the occupation from hundreds of years of Serbia and parts of the Balkans. So Kosovo is this huge part in the national imagination. The complication is that Kosovo is populated 90% by Albanians. And therefore, there's this tremendous tension of to whom does Kosovo belong? And when the war begins, Kosovo belongs to Yugoslavia. The Germans are not stupid, and they realize this is a great way to divide and conquer. And so they give Kosovo to Albania. Oh, that's brilliant. It is brilliant. Yeah. And so now the British are declining to make an active statement as to what their position is on where Kosovo should go. Right. And Peter Kemp is being tasked with going in there and making friends with essentially the nationalists and essentially irredentist groups. And those are groups who are Albanian resistors, and they want to be part of Albania. They want to stay part of Albania. There's been very ugly neighbor against neighbor warfare in Kosovo during this whole thing because just about that local element. So Kemp is trying to get some kind of declaration. The British obviously don't want to do this for a variety of reasons. The communists don't want him anywhere near Kosovo because Tito would like it back.
Yes.
And this is going to be kind of the price of power. So this is why they want Peter Kemp gone.
Yes.
And dead. And that one didn't work because it turns out that they found out that Peter Kemp was still alive. And he then receives with his partner, at this point, he's been given some help, a man named John Hibberdine, an order that they are to tactfully break off with the nationalist resistance that they had been working with, and that he essentially needs to leave the country because he has irritated extensively the local communist resistance groups, the Cosmen.
Right. And this is the order that's coming from the communist mole about because there was one point where they're like, turn yourself over to the communists and then get out of the country. But there's a good chance you're not going to make it because the mole and the communists are working against them to even get out alive in the first place, if I remember correctly.
We're going to get there. Peter Kemp is very worried that this is going to happen to him.
Right.
So he is allowed to leave. He gets essentially, actually, a young boy becomes his guide. It's winter at this point, on foot to hike out of Kosovo into Montenegro.
Oh, that's right.
To turn himself in at Barana, where they are continued to be harassed by the staff office, who tell them that they need to hand over their radio set to the local communists, which would be a very, very bad idea, because if you lose your radio set and you have no more links, they can do whatever they want to you. But eventually Peter Kemp is flown out of Montenegro and is sent back to Italy, where he actually rendezvous with Amory, Smiley, and McLean before they're about to go back in. He wants to go back in.
Right.
He is told no by a man called Philip Leek, who is now the head of the Albanian country section in the staff office. But unfortunately, the Albanian country section, it's smaller than the Yugoslavian country section, of which James Klugman is now the real power. Right. We'll say. And this is about to get even more complicated. So the three go back in. Amory, Smiley, and McLean, and they are dropped to help a nationalist and actually a royalist resistor named Abbas Kupi, who is a supporter of King Zog. Because they're really trying, there's still this contest going on in the staff office that they don't really know about.
Right.
Are we going to pick sides? But right now we are just desperate to pin down these Germans. So in you go, you're going to Kupi. You're going to the Zogists. The partisans have a bunch of weapons. They've got other officers, other SOE officers working with them. You are all going to go and kill Germans. Wow. But they're in the midst of this civil war, infuriating to us, but pretty rationally to the Zogists. They're saying, look, you are telling me you will give me guns and ammunition if I prove that I'm fighting.
Right.
That means I need to fight first and expend ammunition. And what if you don't send it to me? What if I'm out and then the communists strike me?
Right.
So there's a lot of tension here, but they do eventually come to an agreement. David's, this is, I found a very funny story. They're having this meeting. They're in this clearing. They're on a mountain, and a mentally unwell man materializes older, and he's kind of raving, and everyone's sitting around in this meeting, and someone asks for a translation, like, what's going on here? And one of the other Albanian warlords essentially says, oh, ignore him, he's mad.
Right.
And David Smiley, who, off to the side in deep frustration because politics are not his thing and he really is here to fight the Germans, says, I wish he'd bite some of the people here.
To make them crazy.
Because we could all do the crazy thing and just go fight the Germans. This is finally, gets things moving. And Abbas Kupi agrees, okay, fine, I'm going to send you some of my guys. You can blow up another bridge. And you can tell your government, Abbas Kupi is fighting again and we can get this thing rolling. But at this point, the Civil War is absolutely on. And we're starting to get into the summer of 1944 at this point. And this is where, ultimately the staff office changes its mind. Obviously, this is a moment of historical interpretation. Some people say this is the right thing to do. simultaneously, there's very clearly this communist mole in the staff office who is also pushing this.
Right.
And certainly his influence is quite harmful to the personal safety of the men that we're talking about. So they are told that they're changing their backing. They're not going to help these nationalist resistors anymore, and that they need to leave. And then they don't just need to leave. They need to hand themselves over to Enver Hoxha, who at this point has declared war on them and is chasing them around Albania and is trying to overrun their camps.
Yes. It doesn't make any sense.
Hand yourselves over to Hoxha for, you'll be escorted to the coast.
Yeah, right.
And they're really under no illusions that it would be very easy for them to be. Enver Hoxha has declared that they are rebel English, that he is going to have them arrested and tried in a military court. And David Smiley rather clearly says, after going on a lot of recce's by himself, which were some very serious adventures in which he was disguised as a German sergeant at one point, ends up in a lorry full of German soldiers, really brazening it out. I mean, this man is the real deal.
Yeah.
And he says that there's absolutely no reason to believe that we wouldn't be, quote unquote, shot while resisting arrest.
Good point.
Or shot while escaping. So they're very concerned about this, and they are essentially trying to fight their own way to the coast.
Right.
They have with them. We skipped a fun part in the story. Actually, they have with them about 70 Central Asian deserters from the Germans.
Oh, yes.
So let me go backwards because I
Please.
thought this was absolutely fascinating. So while they're having this back and forth at the staff office, and they have decided that they are going to hit the Germans as hard as they can while this, whatever they're doing over there goes on.
Right.
And they still have explosives. They've still got guns and weapons, and they're going to do it. So they just start laying as many ambushes as they can. And they're able to do this partially because they have created almost a company-sized strength of deserters from the Germans who are actually, they've deserted multiple times. They are Central Asians.
Right.
We really feel like this is one of the saddest stories.
Yes.
And I can link this actually to another James Bond pop culture reference at the end. They're Uzbeks, Turkmen, Kazakhs. They were part of the Soviet Union. These are the men that the Soviet Union is always just leaning on and conscripting. And so they've been conscripted by the Soviet Union to fight for them. They were used in human wave attacks of what then was called the Battle of Kharkov, which is now Kharkiv in Ukraine. And at that point surrendered to the Germans. The Germans take them and put them into their own units. It's called the Turkestan Legion. And so they're fighting for the Germans, but they have decided that they really don't like the way that they're being treated by the Germans either. These guys just keep getting kicked around.
Right.
But we are talking about the heirs of Genghis Khan here. I mean, these are pretty serious men.
Yes.
And they're also Muslim. Right. And remember, there's we have a large Muslim population. We are with these Bektashi Zagists. And so one of them makes contact with one of the Zagists, men, and make an offer. And they start coming over in small groups. And, there's no way to verify the story of how they say that they've shot their German officers and they're coming over to them.
Right.
Except one group does think that to provide evidence for this and brings out a green handkerchief with evidence, which is 6 ears.
Oh, my God. Tough guys.
Yeah.
Very
and so
tough.
David Smiley says, excuse me, disregarding the fate of their previous officers, we decided to employ them.
These are fighters, and that's exactly what the SOE needed. Yeah.
Exactly what you need. So they hit a German post with these guys. They're using them on ambushes. Julian Amory ends up leading some of them in an ambush on a machine gun nest.
Right.
Which, in a crazy story, he can't talk to them. Right. He doesn't speak any of their languages, and they don't speak English or French, which he's also fluent in.
Right.
And so he's really just kind of having to lead by example. And this machine gunner essentially sees them earlier than they really wanted to let themselves be seen. And he gets caught under the chin with this incredibly lucky shot that knocks him down, but just grazes him. Right. His men think he's dead, obviously.
Right.
This is what happens when you get shot in the face with a machine gun.
Right.
And he's not. And he realizes, after a second that he's not. He's got all these deserting men behind him.
Yeah.
And he's got a German machine gunner in front of him, and there's really only one option at this point. So he puts his cap, on the front of his gun and just charges shouting. And they all jump up behind him.
Oh my God.
And they charge, the machine gunners flee. And they, if I had saw this particular group of gentlemen, first of all, they know that they were formerly their own troops. Like, this is bad news. And so instead of laying down a line of fire, they run.
Right.
And they take over this village with the Zaugists and with their Central Asian troops. So they are making progress, but they are still told, you've got to get out.
Exactly. Yeah, I love that scene because these are the type of men, don't just tell me, show me that you're as courageous or tough or brave as we are. And when Amory runs forward, they're like, okay, he's still alive. That's good. And he's our kind of guy. That needs to be in a movie.
Going in.
That needs to be in a movie somewhere because I really enjoyed that part. But I want to say, if I could, I want to save their escape. And I think that's the right word from this region. And so the next part, but again, their exploits are just getting started. So as tough as the communists have been, and the communist mole has been in the staff office, some of these SOE agents are about to go up against the man himself, Stalin. So Kemp goes to Poland. He's not supposed to go to Poland. Stalin doesn't want him in Poland because there's certain things that Stalin has an agenda, just like everybody else. But Kemp gets captured at a vital time when he has information that he wants to get to Churchill, but he can't because he's being detained.
Yes, so this is actually, a little bit later, but the original idea here is that the head of the SOE Polish section had wanted to send a unit in during the Warsaw Uprising.
Right. Oh, yes.
Of which, the Polish Home Army has been waiting, and basically the Soviets are approaching Warsaw. They know that the Allies are coming, and they rise to throw out the Germans. And Stalin famously tells his general to stand, to let the Germans wipe out the Polish resistance, because Stalin, as we all know, intends to keep much of Eastern Europe, and he is going to eliminate as much resistance as he can, much as we are also seeing reflections of this in Albania. Get someone else to do your work for you. So Stalin manages to hold off this SOE unit for some time, but eventually they are sent in. But Stalin refuses to allow them to overfly Soviet territory, so they're actually flying out of Italy. It takes them, oh my gosh, four or five attempts to get over the Carpathians, because the weather is so bad. When they eventually get dropped, Peter Kemp never had an uneventful parachute drop. He got dragged on his first drop when he's training at Ringway in England, and when he jumped into Albania, it's very difficult. Dropping in this period, for pilots, is a very difficult task. So just to give them that credit, but he gets dropped a little bit off, and he lands against a rock on the side of a mountain, cracks his head and gets this terrible concussion. And now he's dropped into Poland. They dropped him really low. He thought it might have been as low as 200 feet, which is
wow,
nearly impossible for the parachute to open at that point. So maybe a little bit higher, but it was a fast descent. He wrenches his knee upon landing, and he actually got carted around in a cart for a couple of days. So they're working with the Polish resistors, and Kemp said on his way in, having had such a miserable experience of civil war in Albania, there are obviously communist and non-communist resistance groups in Poland. And he said, their relations were cold but correct. There was none of this nonsense.
Blood feud kind of thing.
Yeah, but they're not fighting one another.
Right.
Yet.
Right.
Right. They are fighting the Germans. And he said, as he was going in, I was just grateful for the opportunity to have to help this gallant people who had done so much to help themselves.
Well said.
Yes. And, obviously echoes today, obviously of Ukraine as well. But they fight with the Poles. They are nearly overrun by the Germans once. They're nearly caught by the Germans another time. There's a young Polish machine gunner, dies covering their escape.
Right.
Kemp is crushed by this because he says, well, how could I possibly justify the sacrifice of this man for my safety? And as they're burying him, the soldier's officer says to the British, we can't even tell his family because they live east of your Curzon line. Oh. Which was the line of control that had been given to Stalin.
Right.
So basically the rule when they went in was that when the Soviets overrun you, right, as they move westwards, you're going to give themselves over. You will give yourselves over to the Soviets, and you'll be transferred out through them, through our allies. That's the deal. Right. You go introduce yourselves. It didn't go that way.
No.
They were imprisoned by the NKVD, who picked them up driving a Lend-Lease Dodge truck, which I always thought was a very bad harbinger.
Right.
But the Yalta Conference is going on at this point, and Stalin wants to make sure that none of the leadership are going to receive candid information out of Poland. And so for about 3 weeks, Peter Kemp and his team, which includes actually the same man he had been in Barana with when they're getting harassed with their radio set. That man had been delivered to Yugoslavia by submarine with Julian Amory, or by Julian Amory, in 1941. He's had a long ride. His name is Bill Hudson. And they put them in jail that they had recently, days previously, acquired from the Gestapo.
Right.
With, as Peter Kemp said, all the fittings.
Ooh.
So you're standard, you're all in one room, the light bulb.
Right.
Listening to some of their Polish contacts, and one of whom was a woman being interrogated the next room over. They're eventually taken out. They're transferred to Moscow, which included a very Soviet joke. They're being told that they're being given back to the British mission in Moscow. They're going to be actually handed over the way they were supposed to be. But as they're taken in, they're in a car, essentially, and the car makes this unscheduled stop at the Lubyanka, the famous prison of the Stalinist secret police.
Right.
Mostly famous for the torture chambers and execution chambers in the basement.
Right.
And they're standing there. The car is stopped at the guard gate, and one of the officers in the car with him gets out, and he hands an envelope, something to the guard at the gate, and gets back in. And then they drive to the British mission.
Oh, my heart stopped when I got to that part of the book. I'm like, oh, they lied. And I guess that in Soviet Russia, that's a joke. That's
just the idea of a joke. We're just going to give them, one more good time on the way to the British mission.
Yes.
Yes. And so, yes, and Kemp eventually gets shipped out of there. But this is a little bit later. But yes, but you see, again, kind of the same themes are happening to them. So they had this very multi-war experience of World War II, right?
Yes.
It's particularly in Eastern Europe, but this shows up when they get to Asia as well. It's really not the Second World War. It's the Second World Wars.
Yes, because there's a lot of different localized wars.
Yeah, there's so many. Well, essentially, all war essentially creates power vacuums, right? And so what's happening in these places is that previous fissures, contests for control are ripped open. And you also have a lot of people who are just trying to do what they think will save themselves and their families.
Right.
Which we are obviously talking at the level of very big isms and whatnot. But the people who made these choices also had they very much had their own reasons for doing them, even if we wouldn't agree with them.
Exactly. Everybody's the hero of their own story. So
yes.
Yeah. So they're out of the Eastern Europe. They get away from Moscow, and now and we're only maybe halfway through the book, and so I've been on this emotional roller coaster through your book. Thank you very much, by the way. And now
you're welcome.
And now, not you, but the story takes a turn that just finishes breaking my heart. So clearly the war in Europe is kind of, it's winding down, if you will. And now they're,
Yes.
they've learned all these skills and they've got so much experience. They want to, obviously, Britain has other needs. They want to keep it going. So now they're thinking about Asia because there's still, the war going on in China and stuff like that. And they get there, but then Julian Amory, who you mentioned a second ago, gets news, come home right away. There's something going on. This, oh my goodness, this was intense. But could you share what was unfolding in his family's life at this time?
Yes. Well, actually, just a quick question. So we haven't finished our evacuation from Albania.
Sorry.
Do you want to? I'll wrap that up real quickly, and then there are actually two very tragic stories, I would argue, with Julian at this point.
Please. Please.
So they're being continually told, you have to hand yourselves over to Hoxha.
Right.
This is not going particularly well. And eventually, they fight their way to the coast, and they're told that they're going to be evacuated. And they have with them Abbas Kupi, this August warlord, their Central Asian troops, a collection of very lucky downed American airmen.
Right.
Who had been in the 8th Army Air Force. They're doing the daylight bombing raids on Ploesti in Romania, the oil fields. And a couple of Italian deserters, and they're trying to get them out, and they're essentially told that you can't take them.
Right.
You can't take you can't take your interpreters. You can't take Kupi. You are going to have to abandon them on the beach. And so they are trying desperately to find another way. Can we hire a boat? Can we do something else? And at the same time, the staff office, and generally classic staff office moment, is saying, by the way, we need your receipts.
Right. Are you insane? Sorry.
Right. Look, it's hard to, this isn't exactly a receipt kind of universe. I'm trying to buy silence here.
Right.
Anyway, but yes, not to be facetious about it, but it's important to make sure that all of the very important back-end logistics things that are crucial to modern warfare get done. But this was bad timing.
Exactly.
So they are eventually forced to leave. They literally leave. They have to leave Kupi. They have to leave their interpreters. When the boat comes to get them, there are officers in there who are supposed to be making sure they're not smuggling anyone out who's not supposed to be there. They are allowed to take two of these Central Asian deserters.
Right.
Come with them. They finally get back to Italy, and they are delighted to find that Kupi managed to find his own boat. And the motor went out. And they were actually picked up by a British ship that tugs them back into harbor. Meanwhile, Enver Hoxha is screaming bloody murder, probably literally back in Albania, insisting that Kupi be returned to him to stand trial. We obviously know how that would end. That is how it ended for the royalist leader in Yugoslavia,
right?
Dragan Mihailovic. Luckily, at this point, the British command intervenes, and General Wilson says, no, he can stay here. Absolutely not. Right. But the other sad story is that they're Central Asian deserters, so they succeed in getting out of this, who have had one hell of a time throughout this war, are interned.
Right.
Because the deal that the Allies made with Stalin was that they are going to return Soviet citizens to the motherland. And we sent back many Soviet citizens to Stalin in this way. The problem being that everyone kind of understood that many of these people, depending on how much exposure they had had to the West, were going to be either shot or sent to the Gulag.
That drove me crazy. It's not so much that they did anything wrong, but just the exposure to the West was enough to make them suspect in Stalin's eyes. Yes. Wow. Sorry.
And this, by the way, this is my pop culture reference. If any of you have seen GoldenEye, the backstory there is that, James Bond is betrayed by Alec Trevelyan, his former partner, who turns out to, be trying to destroy the world,
right?
As James Bond movies do. Right. But the backline to that story is that he had become an MI6 agent. Because he was an orphan, because his parents had been Lienz Cossacks.
That's right.
Who had been a group of people who had been forcibly sent back to the Soviet Union. This happens in a couple of different places in Europe, and many people chose to kill themselves rather than being sent back to Stalin.
Wow.
Obviously, that's fiction.
Yes.
the birthday timelines didn't exactly work out in that one. But this did happen, and these men knew this would happen to their soldiers. And Julian Amory, again, kind of using influence when he thought was necessary, showed up at the internment camp and said, identified himself and asked if he could take his two Turkmen soldiers out to lunch.
Oh, yeah. I know you're in prison, but can I take them for a bite to eat?
And, on his own, he would be responsible for them. And he was given permission to do this, and he took them out to a very nice lunch. And he gave them cash of his own money and said, effectively, see you later.
Yeah, go.
And they disappeared. And he said he was receiving Christmas cards from one of them who had settled in Italy, for decades. Decades thereafter. So he got those two out.
That made me smile. In that part of the book, I was like, yes, the good guys finally win one.
Yeah, a small one, right?
Exactly, but yeah.
The 68 others, but he did what he could for the two of them.
Exactly.
But Julian then has this very wrenching story because they come limping out of Albania. They've done what they could, but they obviously had a rough time of it. And he's back in London, and he suggests to the head of SOE that obviously the war is going on in Asia, and perhaps given the civil war nature of Albania, that they could apply some of the lessons of one of the smaller countries of the world to one of the largest, China.
Right.
And he gets himself appointed to essentially be eyes and ears of SOE in China, and he catches a ride with a rather interesting character, a British general named Adrian Carton-Douillard, who is a long-standing, very fascinating soldier. We can talk about him if you'd like. But Carton allows Amory to essentially be on his staff and be an intelligence officer, figure out what's going on here. Unfortunately, we, the Americans, were uninterested in too much British participation in China and really kind of boxed him out.
Well said.
He had ended up there, though, because he'd given up a different job, which was to be a military attaché in a place called Kashgar, which is a city in what was then called Xinjiang, which we now call Xinjiang, which was the home of the Uyghurs in far western China.
Right.
Again, kind of, just on the other side of the roof of the world. They've just had this experience with their Central Asian deserters. And he gives it up because he's had to come home for two reasons. Billy McLean ends up taking this job, and we can talk about that. He is running for Parliament. He'd already been asked to stand, and there's an election on, and Churchill is quite anxious about having absentee candidates for good reason.
Right.
Obviously, Churchill loses that election.
Yeah.
And so he's going home. But there's another reason, because his older brother, John Amory, always known as Jack, was being tried for treason. And Jack Amory was a fascist, Jack Amory was a traitor, and there's nothing that excuses his behavior. But he was also a very complicated person.
Right.
He was 7 years older than his brother Julian. They hadn't had a close relationship, and Jack Amory was a very problematic character. He'd been declared bankrupt by the time he was in his mid-20s. He had a shocking number of motor vehicle violations. When he was extremely young, he married a prostitute, neglecting the formality of divorce. He later married another who died actually asphyxiating on her own vomit after an extremely drunken night in Berlin with Jack,
right.
Who had at that point offered himself up to the Nazis. So Jack was in France when the Nazis invaded and decided that he was going to go with them. And he ended up going to Berlin. He had one of these radio shows, where the Germans, like with Lord Haha,
right.
they would try to get people from allied countries to go on the radio and tell everyone how foolish they were, and so on and so forth. So Jack had one of these, which was obviously as unpleasant as it gets, and he was also trying, but failed mostly, to recruit British soldiers out of POW camps to join, like, essentially a Nazi, probably technically would have been an SS unit. He was going to call the St. George Legion.
Right.
I think only a very small handful of people were ever interested in that concept. So Jack was absolutely, full throttle engaged. What he was doing was treason. But there was also this question of, is Jack Amory insane?
Yeah.
Because his behavior is absolutely atrocious. So he's brought back. He's captured actually in Europe. He's brought back to stand trial with his third wife at this point, who's from the same profession as the previous women. They were not formally married. By everyone's account, she was actually a very, very nice woman.
Right.
But he's on trial for treason. And here it is, cabinet minister's son on trial for treason. And Julian Amory had always feared, when the Germans invaded France, and he had said to a friend at the time, like, I know exactly what's going to happen. Jack is going to go over to the other side, because it was kind of who he was. He was this really problematic personality. He was simultaneously incredibly intelligent, but would never do what he was supposed to. Like, passes his exams for Oxford and tells his father that he's not going. A lazy child who could also do interesting sports when he felt like it. There were allegations that he had tried to poison Julian with silver in his milk bottles as a child.
Wow.
That he had been extremely difficult to his teachers, that he had frightened his first wife with some of his preferences, all sorts of things about Jack Amory. Certainly he was a somewhat seductive personality. He managed to make friends with and almost politically convert several of the guards when he was in prison.
Right. Wow.
There's a lot going on with Jack Amory, but to me, this was Jack Amory committed treason. Jack Amory was a fascist. That's the end of the line. But this was, to me, a story about, well, how does Julian Amory experience this? What's going on with his family?
Yes.
Julian had said, and this is what I found quite sad, he ultimately wrote an autobiography of his time during the war, and when he published it, there was nothing about Jack in it.
Right.
But when I went through his papers, when I went through the archive, I find this full draft chapter of this story, of what it was like for Julian. So he wrote out the whole thing and decided that he was just not going to tell the story publicly during his lifetime. And he had said in that, when I found out what he was doing, at one point, Jack was on one of his radio kind of, or tours rather, like in Belgrade. So he's actually very close to his brother Julian, behind enemy lines in Albania.
Right.
In the grand scheme of things, obviously.
Sure.
And Julian wrote, had it been within my power to ambush his car, I would have.
Oh, my goodness.
He and his father immediately offered their resignations. Obviously they are refused.
Right.
But when his brother comes back and he's in prison on trial, he decides this is crushing my parents. He's still my brother. I'm going to do what I can legally to defend him. And the family tries to post an insanity defense. Jack Amory pleads guilty. He refuses to defend himself.
Right. His
lawyers are appalled. The judge is appalled. They're going to have this trial. Murderers caught in the act plead guilty. Jack Amory refused to plead guilty. And he wouldn't do it. His family tried to pose an insanity defense. And, depending on how you look at it, maybe there was good evidence for this. Of course, when they go to collect the evidence from, his kindergarten teachers and everyone, this is all in the aftermath. So you can never know how much it's influenced by his later behavior, right? Because people are providing this evidence. Certainly his behavior was something else. He refuses to plead guilty. He's all over the papers. He has acquired the thing that he wants, which is dramatic attention. He asks to be executed in jackboots and a black shirt. The governor of the prison, not understanding fascist dress code, initially says yes. When it's pointed out to him what this is, he withdraws this permission.
Yes.
So to his last moments, there's this back and forth. The executioner later says that Jack is one of the braver men he'd ever met. And Jack Amory is executed for treason.
Oh, and you touched on something a second ago. So for Jack, I mean, yes, complicated. Yes, maybe there was something off about him mentally, emotionally, but his actions were clear. He was a traitor. That's fine. But you tell the story almost through Amory's eyes or Amory's emotions, and it just.
Yes.
I mean, because you just see this family being ripped apart, but still trying to come together. And it was a very poignant part of the book. Having said that, we are only halfway through the book because, again, these guys have these certain skills. And I remember when I got to the part where he's hanged and hanged, I don't know. I remember going, there's a lot of pages left. And then I realized that, yes, World War II is over, but then there's the beginning of the Cold War. We need information, and these gentlemen have acquired certain skills that would be perfect for that. So I'm going to ask you, because I just wanted to focus on World War II, but could you give us an idea of some of their actions after World War II, please?
Yeah, absolutely. And even, the war isn't even over for everybody else yet, because David Smiley and Peter Kemp have actually dropped into occupied Thailand by the Japanese.
Right.
And they are going to be operating behind enemy lines. They drop in pretty late. And actually the war ends pretty soon after this, but it's still very dangerous because the Japanese army in the field does not feel defeated.
Right.
Is not arguably defeated. And so there are some tremendous moments here. David Smiley actually suffers very serious wounds from an exploding briefcase. You mentioned the gadgets earlier. There's warning of a Japanese patrol, and he's trying to burn papers. 5 pounds of thermite blow up in his face. He's evacuated, ends up going back in. Peter Kemp joins him. They end up liberating POW camps. One of these camps actually held men who had been forced illegally to work on what was called the Thai-Burma Railway, also known as the Railway of Death, obviously made famous by the novel and film The Bridge on the River Kwai. Mm-hmm. So they finish up World War II in Thailand, and then Peter Kemp is briefly military governor of Bali.
Wow.
Takes a surrender there, which actually was a somewhat terrifying experience. There's also kind of a civil war going on in Bali because they are also trying to get rid of their Dutch colonial masters. This is complicated in Thailand as well because the French Empire is falling apart. The Americans have teams there that are involved. So there's all sorts of unfortunate skills being acquired in this, but they don't stop in World War II.
Exactly.
The next thing they all go do together is actually in 1949. All four of them are involved in different ways with helping a group of Albanian resistors, I guess we'll call them, try to land back in then now communist Albania, completely controlled by Enver Hoxha, to pull essentially a Bay of Pigs before the Bay of Pigs, right?
Right.
And that operation is betrayed probably by some intelligence lapses, but also by Kim Philby of the Cambridge Five, who at this point is operating quite freely within high ranks of British intelligence. So they do all this together. Then they have various other operations separately. Before that, David Smiley had actually himself ended up in Poland. He had been declared PNG, persona non grata, and thrown out,
right,
as being the military attaché.
Right.
Peter Kemp ended up in Budapest during the revolution in 1956. Peter Kemp and Billy McLean both ended up in Congo during the wars of decolonization in the 1960s. They overlapped again in Algeria during an operation trying to extract a particular political figure there that had, again, interesting American involvement. At Julian Emery's instigation, David Smiley eventually in the late 1950s became the head of the military forces of the Sultan of Oman.
Wow.
With Billy McLean thereafter, he was also, with Emery's help, was involved in what was then called the Yemen, now just Yemen, helping a group of royalists who paid allegiance to the imam who controlled the country, fighting against Egyptian and Soviet-backed rebels there. It was called the War That Never Was.
Right.
They were essentially involved in advising and hiring essentially a group of mercenaries who weren't really fighters so much as trainers. The term gets thrown around quite a bit.
Yes.
And they were involved pretty much everywhere. Peter Kemp ended up in Vietnam in the 1960s and in a couple of other places in Southeast Asia doing interesting things, revisiting some of the places he had been back in 1945.
Wow.
Billy McLean showed up there at one point as well. McLean and Amory, towards the very end of their lives, were involved in, trying to help the Afghans resist the then Soviet invasion of Afghanistan.
Right.
So they really were in it until the very end, 50 years. And as communist Albania fell apart, a few of them, Peter Kemp ended up actually on another mission to Kosovo before this happened. But a few of them did get to go back. Amory and Smiley got to go back. And in one of my favorite stories, 50 years later, found one of those interpreters that they'd met had to leave on the beach.
Right.
And who they tried to find for decades, who they were certain had been liquidated by Hoxha, and there he was.
Oh.
Still alive. Half a century, my dear.
Yes.
You saw them.
A nice ending for him, for certainly all the things that happened up until, during those 50 years. And if I could just say, again, to the readers, believe it or not, we have left out tons of information that's covered in this book. So again, the first half of the book, really good point of view of World War II from Eastern Europe. I learned so much, and I really appreciate that. But you said something at the very end of the book in the epilogue, and I'm just going to paraphrase, because again, the Nazis, evil, simple to understand. The communists were our partners, and they talk about a lot of good things, but could we trust them? Could we not? But you make the point in the epilogue, at the end of the day, it comes down to what someone does. It's their actions. It's not their words. That is how you really can tell what their objective is. And that's something we need to remember. Don't fall for the sleight of hand. It's what someone does or does not do that really determines their character.
Yes, absolutely. And obviously, we live in a new information age of information operations.
Yes.
Always worth keeping in mind. As I also said in the end, so much of our world looks obviously completely unrecognizable to them, but one thing obviously wouldn't, which would be, obviously a new rise of authoritarian and totalitarian attempt to dominate its neighbors, obviously in this case being Russia and Ukraine and Europe again.
Exactly. So, the more it changes, the more it stays the same.
Exactly.
A little cliche, but true, and that's why we still say it. So, Dr. Monaghan, thank you very much for your time. Thank you for this book. Again, the book is A Quiet Company of Dangerous Men, The Forgotten British Special Operations Soldiers of World War II. Again, thank you for this book, and thank you for your time today.
Thank you so much.
Hello, and thank you for listening to The History of World War II podcast, episode 487, part 2, Merry Christmas from the Eastern Front. Last time, General Guderian's hubris, or self-focus, meant that his left wing did not link up with the right wing of Fourth Army, situated west by southwest of Moscow. So, when the second phase of General Zhukov's counterattack got started on December 18th, it pushed General Felder's 8th Army Corps to the northwest and General Henrici's 43rd Army due west towards Kaluga. Thus, an ever-widening gap was taking place. The question now was, would the Russians be left alone to exploit this, or would Kluge realize what was happening and react accordingly within Hitler's parameters? Kluge sprung into action. After taking on Hitler and winning permission to retreat as needed, he next needed to stem the building tide that was about to roll up his line from the south. The southern half of the Fourth Army had only one mobile unit, the 19th Panzer Division, but it was currently fighting in part with the 57th Panzer Corps, holding back the Soviets just north of the ever-widening hole. Yet, as the only mobile unit in the area, it would have to do. Slowly and painfully pulling the 19th Panzer Division out of the fighting, Kluge added another 1,000 troops to it and sent it to hit the Soviets trying to roll up the Fourth Army. Things did not go exactly as planned. It's not like the Soviets were driven from the field, but the fighting meant that Fourth Army's cohesion, or what was left of it, was now, for the moment, safe. And even better for Fourth Army, its center and northern flank were holding, again, due to their defensive works constructed before the ground hardened from the cold. This German defiance in the center and north forced one Soviet regimental commander to request a 12-hour postponement to look for a more efficient way to attack. But his superior kept his response short and sweet, demonstrating the priorities of Stalin. You will attack at once. If not, I'm afraid your health will suffer. The attacks continued, and Russian men continued to fall. But there was method to Stalin's madness. As General Kirchner, commander of the 57th Panzer Corps, wrote in his diary, the Russian can constantly replenish his formation. In this way, he is continuously allotted rested men who, in their numerical superiority, are a considerable fighting force against our weary troops. Further south, Guderian's 2nd Panzer Army and 2nd Army, led by General Schmidt, was equally pressed by Zhukov's attack. But prior to the launched counterattack, Guderian had already requested permission to speak to Hitler personally, and Bach, before he got the boot, had said yes. Thus, the prima donna Guderian was standing before Hitler at his Wolf's Lair headquarters in East Prussia during the afternoon of December 20th. In his absence, General Schmidt was in command of both armies, and he had his hands full as there was an enemy breakthrough on the southern end of 2nd Army, in between the 9th Panzer Division and the 16th Motorized Infantry Division. In fact, there might have been 2 more breakthroughs of Soviet troops, but intelligence was scanty at best in the early phase of this Soviet attack. But what seemed clear was that Soviet medium and heavy tanks were making for the Tim River, just behind these parts of Army Group Center. The reason for this was that Zhukov was guessing, correctly it seems, that Army Group Center would seek to fall back enough to build their next defensive line just behind that very river. And indeed, Kluge had already asked permission for exactly that. But thinking of his audience, Kluge also put in his request that he would send the 9th Panzer Division at the enemy to not only buy time, but to take the fight, in a limited way, to the enemy. And Kluge, anticipating his next request, ended with, "But even if the 9th Army lands a serious blow, and even if we do fall back to the Tim, that might not be enough." He also needed freedom of action to make local withdrawals when hesitation and the avoidance of unnecessary losses demands it. And yet, Hitler's reply on December 20th was equally short. It was 9. To this, Kluge's reply was that there was a real threat that the entire army group might be frontally overrun, which was the worst of all possible scenarios. But to salvage his army and his job, Kluge sent on the 9th Panzer, who engaged the Soviets from December 20th to the 22nd. All told, this localized German counterattack to the Soviet counterattack cost the Russians another 1,000 men lost and 4 artillery pieces. This was not much in the great sea of Soviet military might, but the German intensity during this attack shocked the untrained and under-equipped Soviet forces before them. But more than racking up any enemy casualties, the Germans bought themselves with this attack more time, as the Soviets stalled to find a way to fight better, if not harder.
Hey, history lover. You're listening to this podcast because you like great storytelling and learning from the past. Airwave History Plus is your ticket to the most popular history shows anywhere with ad-free listening, bonus content, early episodes, and more from 27 top podcasts, including History That Doesn't Suck, The Explorers Podcast, The History of World War II, Queen's Podcast, The Age of Napoleon, and many more. To get your free 7-day trial, go to the Apple page for this podcast and click subscribe. That's Airwave History Plus, the essential audio destination for history lovers. Available now on Apple Podcasts.
Having battled the Soviets to a temporary halt here, Kluge continued to send requests to retreat to Hitler's headquarters. But Halder, the Chief of Staff of the Army High Command, or OKH, phoned Kluge and told the Field Marshal Hitler would only allow a retreat to the Tim River if the rearward line was so prepared that a successful infantry defense can be guaranteed. Of course, Kluge could make no such promise, as the bulk of his forces were trying to stave off the damn communists in the first place. He even wrote to Halder, and it's worth noting that Kluge was at the point of saying, "If I had known the job would be like this working with Hitler, I never would have taken it." Well, his paragraph to the Chief of Staff can be summed up with, "Tell Der Fuhrer that he can take his willpower speech and shove it up the backside of his trench coat." Maybe he should have taken a page from Guderian's book. Or perhaps not. When Guderian met with Hitler at 6 p.m. on December 20th, it was becoming clear that for the last few days, Guderian had been secretly, quietly taking one regiment from the 2nd Panzer Army at a time out of the line and sending them back to the Oka River, about 70 kilometers to the west. This was further than what Kluge was trying to immediately do. But worse, and Kluge would phone Hitler's office while the leader was talking to Guderian, the egocentric Panzer General was trying to abandon Army Group Center altogether. For what other conclusion could there be? He and his would be removed too far away to be of any help. This, too, was placed into Hitler's ear after Kluge's phone call. And believe it or not, Hitler took this new information calmly. No, not really. He screamed so loud, no one outside the office had any trouble hearing what he was saying. So Guderian tried a few counterpoints, the last one being, well, the process has already begun, and to reverse it now, while being attacked, would be suicide. But clearly the man forgot who he was talking to. Guderian was dressed down in the strongest terms possible, and the meeting ended with no agreement, and both men still wanting to pursue their own course because they thought they knew best. But in the end, Guderian won, or rather lost, because the Russians simply kept coming during those days of the 3rd week of December. The result? His men were pushed back enough so that Guderian ended up giving the order, officially, to fall back to the Oka River. The retreat order had been given on December 22nd, but only after Guderian himself had rushed to that part of the line under the greatest pressure, that being of the 53rd Army Corps that had already suffered 2 breaches, which meant, to some degree, enemy units were already operating in their rear. And when it was clear what Guderian was doing, he fessed up the next day, saying within 48 hours, the remainder of 2nd Army would be at the Oka River. Kluge, when hearing this, yelled over the phone that this was against Hitler's orders, and he would hear of it. And true to his word, because he had his own agenda, which was not apparent at first, Kluge was on the phone to Halder, telling him that Guderian had been lying the entire time about exactly where 2nd Panzer was, for elements were already heading west. But when Halder screamed that Guderian should be court-martialed, Kluge did not agree. Instead, he clearly said Guderian must have had a good reason for doing this. Clearly, it was either retreat or have his entire army destroyed, which would not serve Hitler's purposes at all. Kluge had heard that same day that some units were grumbling about being given the order to retreat so late that they had to make hard decisions about what to keep and what to leave behind. That is, until another massive wave of attacks came on December 24th. Now these same men were throwing everything down and running, while comrades who were next to them fell with bullets in their backs. Meanwhile, enemy soldiers were just 100 yards behind them in pursuit. And this would happen over and over again. But there was still enough hours left in December 24th for some additional hell. Schmidt, commander of the Second Army, radioed Kluge to tell him that one German-held town had just been overrun by the Soviets, and Second Army was about to lose another one. There was nothing he could do. That 48th Panzer Corps was in full retreat. Their goal, the Tim River. After the sun set that day and the Soviets eased up, Kluge spoke to Guderian. Both men were at the end of their tether, with Hitler saying, "Nothing we say, do, or plan will change our current situation." Then Guderian asked to be relieved of command, and that he had no objection if he was to be placed before a military tribunal. But Kluge did not have time for this. He did not have time for Guderian. Knowing that the bulk of Guderian's army was already at the Oka-Zuza line, he ended the call with no and no more retreats. That night was Christmas Eve for the Germans, but the holiday only made the soldiers miss home even more, and they certainly wanted to be anywhere but where they were. Gone were their triumphant calls of another victory by the Wehrmacht. The men enjoyed what they could, what little they had, and then got on with the war. Or rather, they got on with the war because the Russians launched another large offensive on Christmas Eve. Of course, to the Russians, it was not Christmas Eve, as they followed the old Julian calendar, followed by Orthodox Christians. Thus, German lines were overrun. Units were surrounded, more equipment lost. But for some of these trapped men, this was actually their best Christmas ever, as the Russians were still learning to hold on to what they caught. Meaning most times the Germans were able to get out of these traps, either due to the panicked Russians or their lack of coordination. They would get better in time, but for now, the race was back on again. The Germans would retreat under direct orders this time, and the Russians would chase after them. In fact, a pattern had already formed, and it held true for Christmas Eve. The Soviets would come tearing in, overrun German lines, who would then get up and run west, and then at an agreed time or place, they would stop and quickly reform their lines. And though losing equipment when this happened, they still had enough left over to pour a withering fire into the oncoming Russians, which would force them to pause and lick their wounds. Some time would pass, fresh Soviet troops would be brought up, and they would charge forward again, repeating the cycle. Thus the Russians lost many more men, unnecessarily, but the Germans, they were losing men too, all the while losing ground. Moscow, that was getting further and further away. Not that many of the German soldiers cared anymore. No, they just wondered if they would ever see home again, or if this damn cold would ever unwrap its fingers from around their bodies.
Welcome to True Spies, the podcast that takes you deep inside the greatest secret missions of all time.
Suddenly out of the darkness appeared bin Laden.
You'll meet the people who live life undercover. What do they know? What are their skills? And what would you do in their position?
Vengeance felt good. Seeing these people pay for what they'd done felt righteous.
True Spies from Spyscape Studios, wherever you get your podcasts.
Meanwhile, far away from the fighting, Christmas was, overall, a more happy occasion for the Army's high command. But first, for comparison, General Reinhardt and Panzer Group 3, at the northern end of Army Group Center's area of responsibility, their Christmas celebration had to be postponed until that afternoon, as the Russians launched several attacks that day, demanding his attention. As for Henrichi's 48th Panzer Corps, having enemy troops to either side of it, and Felber's 8th Army Corps to the 48th left, the Germans here, the men and their command staff, spent the day putting out fires. Sometimes their counterattacks worked, sometimes not, but there was always a true method of success for the Germans: fall back and reform the line. And Guderian, he, and this is to his credit, spent the day checking on his wounded men, spreading cheer in his own way. which leaves the Army's headquarters at Mauerwald in German or Mamerki in Polish, located in northeast Poland. The air there was much more festive, with Halter having a fine time. And it might have been a bit cheerier on the front line if the troops had been receiving the same amount of supplies that they had been receiving before November. During that month, 16 trains arrived to the front versus 31, which had been the number before. Further, it seems that the trains were not going as close to the front as they used to before dumping their cargo. And Lieutenant General Rudolf Gurk, the chief of Wehrmacht transport, knowing which side his bread was buttered, had told Halder just days before Christmas that 122 trains were leaving for the front each day. This was clearly a lie. Then Gurk told Hitler on New Year's Day that it would soon be 140 trains. Again, further from the truth. Either way, Hitler's suspicion was starting to grow. He never fully trusted anyone, and that was based on how he treated people. So he had his Luftwaffe adjutant, Nicholas von Bülow, snoop around. The truth came out, and in a fit of rage, Hitler transferred responsibility of the rail lines to civilian authorities. Now, this would change back in mid-1942, but then the individual Army Group Center commanders would have direct control. But the damage had already been done. But what had set Hitler off the most in the report was that the Eastern troops, his troops, had no or very little winter clothing and no means of receiving sufficient supplies on a regular basis. Now he understood when all those around him said his willpower speeches were simply not enough. As for the trucks that went from the trains to the front, a simple stat will suffice. Each army, that is, each of the many armies that comprised Army Group Center, needed 2,700 tons of supplies each day. By mid-November, this was down to 360 tons, and the rest of the winter would not be any better. What would have made things better was if more Soviet trains had been captured for the first 6 months. But thanks to Stalin's scorched earth policy, mixed with him sacrificing entire armies to buy time, much of Soviet rail transportation had been pulled back, always just out of reach of the Wehrmacht. So where the invaders may have expected a captured train for their pains, they found an empty platform. Or put it another way, Merry Christmas from the Eastern Front. Greetings, everyone, from Central Virginia. So I just want to say hi to some new members. I hope you're enjoying the interviews. I've really, it's been a while since I've done one, and I was actually a little nervous. But anyway, I forgot how much fun it is to explore and to read books just for the fun of it. So I hope you're enjoying them as much as I do. And remember, hey, Christmas is coming up. If you need to get that one person who's kind of hard to buy for, here's some books that could be considered. And I think there's a couple more interviews coming up in the future, but I will try to add regular episodes to them so you don't have to wait for the main storyline. Anyways, so for the latest members, let's see here. Charles McCallion, I hope I said that right, Charles, from Palm Coast, Florida. Kelton Barr from St. Louis Park, Minnesota. Gerald Parker from Grass Valley, California. Actually sounds like a cool place. Glenn Bourne, I think that's Jason Bourne's cousin. Don't quote me on that, from Havelock North in New Zealand. And let's see here. As far as a donation, Peter Matar made a donation. Thank you very much, Peter. And as far as my last from the current selection, Churchill mug, Paul Jepson from Avon, Colorado bought it. So I've ordered some more, and Christmas is coming up if you want to get someone a Churchill mug, or yourself, because you love yourself. There's nothing wrong with that. If you live in the U.S. and in Canada, please, you can just go on the website and order it. If not, just send me an email. Tell me where you live, and we can work out the details from there. And again, the email is just wwiipodcast@gmail.com. And I'll quote your price. You say yes or no. we go from there. Anyway, so things are getting pretty tough for the Germans. They keep having to back up. I guess their goal for right now is to just survive the winter, but their winter's just started, so we'll see how it goes. As always, take care, everyone.
Hey, history lover. You're listening to this podcast because you like great storytelling and learning from the past. Airwave History Plus is your ticket to the most popular history shows anywhere with ad-free listening, bonus content, early episodes, and more from 27 top podcasts, including History That Doesn't Suck, The Explorers Podcast, The History of World War II, Queen's Podcast, The Age of Napoleon, and many more. To get your free 7-day trial, go to the Apple page for this podcast and click subscribe. That's Airwave History Plus, the essential audio destination for history lovers. Available now on Apple Podcasts.
Welcome to True Spies, the podcast that takes you deep inside the greatest secret missions of all time.
Suddenly out of the darkness appeared bin Laden.
You'll meet the people who live life undercover. What do they know? What are their skills? And what would you do in their position?
Vengeance felt good. Seeing these people pay for what they'd done felt righteous.
True Spies from Spyscape Studios, wherever you get your podcasts.